Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Subcommittee on Education for the Finance and Appropriations Committee. We would like to go ahead and get started and welcome. We'd like to have our esteemed subcommittee members introduce themselves, although you probably already know who they are. So, Madam Chair.
My name is Eloise Lucas, and I represent the 18th Senatorial District, which includes now just Portsmouth and Chesapeake. It used to be 12 localities, so now it's kind of compact. I'm happy to be here on the committee, Madam Chair.
I am Mark Obenchain, represent the 2nd Senate District, the central Shenandoah Valley of Virginia, from Page, Rockingham, Harrisonburg, Augusta, and then out west to Highland and Bath counties.
And I'm Mamie Locke. I represent the 23rd Senate District, which is all of the city of Hampton and half of the city of Newport News. So again, welcome to our first meeting of the subcommittee. I'd like to make we've got one more introduction, so we'll let Senator Hashmi introduce herself and then we'll get started.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and good afternoon. Ghazala Hashmi, representing the 15th Senatorial District, parts of City of Richmond and Chesterfield.
Thank you. This year, the committee will be both the higher ed and K through 12, one committee. We will meet on Tuesdays at 3:30 and on Thursdays at 3. This is a broad topic, so we will try to have our meetings focus on higher education on Tuesdays and K-12 on Thursdays, but we'll start that on next week. Wendy King and Anya Pfeiffer will be staffing our committees, so please reach out to them if you have any questions relative to our subcommittee. Over the next few meetings, we plan to schedule several presenters to provide additional information to help us in our work. If there are specific areas of interest that you would like to hear about, please let us know. This afternoon, we have 3 presentations. First, Anya and Wendy will provide an overview of the proposed budget in K-12 education. Next, Wendy will provide an overview of the higher education budget. And finally, we will hear from Chev regarding their budget recommendations. So first, Anya and Wendy.
At the top. Oh, I hear it. So I'll start with K-12 background, and then we'll move into the overview of the introduced budgets. We'll talk about rebenchmarking salaries and sales tax and lottery forecasts and early childhood, as well as the proposed amendments in Senate Bill 29 and 30. And just to make a quick note on this, in terms of background and overview, a lot of these slides will look familiar from our annual meeting, but we're happy to answer any questions that may have come up on those in regards to the introduced budget. So first, as an overview of the subcommittee in this area, general fund support for education totaled $12.6 billion in fiscal year 2024. And this subcommittee is focusing on both K-12 and higher education. K-12 goes into pre-K through 12, direct aid, the Department of Education, and then the Virginia School for the Deaf and Blind. And in other education, we cover the Library of Virginia, the various museums such as the Science Museum, Gunston Hall, the Virginia Museum of Natural History, the Jamestown-Yorktown Foundation, and then the Virginia Commission for the Arts. And on the higher education side, which Wendy will talk about in our second presentation a little bit later, of course, we have Chev and our various public institutions and cooperative extensions, which Wendy will detail a little bit more specifically later. Funding for pre-K-12 has grown by 68.2% over the last 10 years. Again, this is a duplicate from our annual meeting, so hopefully this looks a little bit familiar, but we've seen a big increase in our direct aid to public education as well as in investments in central office operations at the Department of Education. And that is largely a result of the move of early childhood from the Department of Social Services to the Department of Education, which is why that percent change is so large. Again, another slide that may look familiar, but just to recap, we know enrollments has been a big topic of conversation in recent years. Public school enrollment increased slightly after the pandemic, but is still expected to decline through 2030. So you can see that COVID did change that 2019 projected trend and it's now lower, the 2023 preliminary projections that you can kind of see there. So we are still expecting to see that decline over the next couple of years. And then following that, K-12 enrollment is also expected to decline over the biennium. So here we have a graph that shows our average daily membership from fiscal year 20 to the projected fiscal year 26. Those first 4 bars in gray are the final ADM numbers, and then the blue bars represent projected ADM. And something important to note here is that our fiscal year 24 bar does represent the projected ADM, although Senate Bill 29 does have an updated ADM that is about 10,000 students lower. However, we left the projected ADM in this chart because that was the number that was used in the rebenchmarking calculations. So we wanted to leave that for reference. But as you can see, over this biennium, we are expecting to see a decline or a continued decline in K-12 enrollment. In Virginia, 10 of our school divisions enroll about half of our K-12 students. So in fall of 2023, 121 school divisions were enrolling 47% of students, and then the other 10 were enrolling the remaining 53. I'm sure we're all familiar with what these big divisions are, but Fairfax County, Prince William County enrolled the most students, followed pretty closely by Loudoun and Chesterfield and Virginia Beach. In tandem with that, Virginia's divisions do vary pretty widely in size. So although 53% of our students are in just 10 divisions, we have 69 divisions that are enrolling between 1,000 and 5,000 students. So this is important when we're thinking about how these different decisions impact divisions of different sizes and how the vast majority of our divisions are enrolling 1,000 to 5,000 students. And just to recap investments from the last biennium, you can see here that we had some changes in one-time investments, ongoing policy changes, and technical changes that were updated with regards to rebenchmarking, and we'll see that again later as we move into this year's rebenchmarking numbers, which we'll talk about in the introduced budget section of this presentation. And to zoom in on this a little bit more, recent investments focused on salaries, support positions, reading specialists, at-risk students, and other one-time investments. So we had $782 million invested in salary increases. We had $145 million invested in the at-risk add-on support to increase that from 24% to 36%. And then, as I mentioned, those investments in K-3 reading specialists following the Virginia Literacy Act, and then early childhood care and education. We also had some significant one-time investments in school construction and flexible per pupil funding, among other things. So we just wanted to highlight that as we're moving into the new introduced budget. And just so we're aware of where we are with federal relief funds, those do remain available through September 2024, but the amount that's been obligated and the amount that's been obligated is increasing, the amount that's remaining is decreasing, and we can see that we do have a fair amount remaining in ESSER 3 that school districts will need to obligate by September of this year. And then talking about direct aid, the majority of appropriations here are provided through the Standards of Quality or SOQ funding framework. So there are 5 big categories here, and we've broken them out by the investments made in fiscal year 2024 and then the percentage of direct aid that they make up. So you can see that Standards of Quality accounts do make up the largest portion of this. They make up almost 80%. And that's sales tax, basic aid, textbooks, CTE, VRS, ESL, summer school, things like that. And then other highlights, the compensation supplement and rebenchmarking hold harmless made up a very significant chunk of this in the previous biennium or in the last fiscal year. And then we also have lottery proceeds, categorical accounts, and supplemental accounts that make up the remainder of the direct aid money. And I will pass it off to Wendy for the overview of the introduced budget.
And I know we've covered a lot, although these are things from the annual meeting, but we can also pause here and see if there's any specific questions before we go over the budget.
Any questions over what Anya just went over?
Yeah. So with respect to the COVID funds and their obligation, does that mean we have to statutorily or through the budget obligate those funds or we lose them? Is that how the obligation of those funds works?
Madam Chair, trying to get back to that slide. These are the ESSER funds that went directly to the school divisions, and so these, we do have, sorry, actually, I think we.
It's mine, I'm sorry.
Still learning the technology in the room, that we are tracking to make sure that all of them are obligated by the school divisions. And I think they are designated, I need to get back to you, they are designated for those school divisions. So if the school divisions don't spend them, I'm not sure that we can bring them up to a state level to do it, but I will confirm that. But we do have reports, and I know DOE is continuing to track the status of these as well. And we have a more recent report. I think we're down to a much smaller number than you see here in terms of what's also obligated. This is what's been expensed, but it does seem that school divisions are moving with us and trying to spend down as much as they can. Moving over to the introduced budget, SB 29, so this is the caboose bill. This is an amendment to FY 24. This is where we do have updates to direct education, and these are largely a result of technical changes because of that ADM, the final ADM projections, which by the change in the ADM, that does have a ripple effect into the various programs that then get reduced based on an enrollment. And so that additional expected decline based on the final end-of-year enrollment results in a $282 million in reductions or savings for this fiscal year. Moving over to the governor's introduced budget, which is for this biennium, the introduced budget proposes a net increase of $174 million general fund and $686 million in non-general fund over the biennium. I'll highlight a few of these, and we have some tables after, but the large investment that we see is in the child care subsidy program, and we've got a few slides later on in the presentation to describe what's happening with that. We also plan to have Department of Education come in and provide a presentation to that later this week. The other one is an investment through the literary fund. That's some use of funds to help pay for teacher retirement in non-general fund, as well as some general fund to help reduce the unfunded liabilities in that program. There is a reduction in the elimination of the sales tax on food. So this was something that was passed in the last biennium, that when the General Assembly had decided to remove the food and personal hygiene tax, that there was a hold harmless enacted for that. This has now been removed for this biennium. There's $30 million in the college partnership laboratory schools, $61.2 million to expand the reading staffing specialist. This is part of the Literacy Act, all the way through 8th grade. $53 million for a 1% bonus, and $22.8 million for a 2% raise. That bonus is in the first year, and the raise is in the second year. And $40 million across the biennium for a new statewide assessment contract. As a note, at the annual meeting, we presented on the rebenchmarking costs. I think originally we had a number about $1.5 billion. The newest cost for the rebenchmarking, when there was adjustments based on enrollments, is now $969 million. But if you recall, because we had such a large investment of one-time funds, we were able to redirect those savings. And those one-time funds were over $1 billion. That our net cost of rebenchmarking is actually a reduction of $204 million. The reason we try to present the cost versus the one-time funds that we use for it is to know that in future versions of rebenchmarking, we really know what the true cost of trying to do all these updates are for. These tables provide a further breakout of the things that we mentioned in the major investments. A few others it's about 2/3 of the way down on the page. Diploma Plus grants, there's 20 million for these. These are grants to provide to students, and through the high school, priority is on the 11th and 12th grade students. These are anyone who's eligible to enroll into high school and be able to work towards an industry credential. In addition, there's a few other items that we didn't cover in that first slide regarding the removal of a cap in Rappahannock School Division, as well as supplemental support for Accomack and Northampton. On the non-general fund side, we mentioned this earlier, for teacher retirement, what was done is that we had a teacher retirement contribution, and we used excess money from the literary fund to help pay for that. So there was a reduction of general fund to then use the literary funds to help pay for teacher retirement. In addition, there's a payment of $235 million in literary funds to support unfunded liabilities with the literary fund, and we'll show you a little bit more on that. And last, on school construction, last biennium we had provided funds through literary fund as well as some other sources of revenues. But the casino gambling proceeds, which are designed to start dedicating as a source for school construction, and of course we have more casinos coming online. This is the first deposits we're starting to see of $80 million projected each year from the gambling proceeds to help support school construction in that fund that was established last biennium. I'll pause there to see if there's any additional questions for these two areas.
Wendy, I have a question. Is the 80 million just from the 2 casinos that are online?
I'll have to look into that. This is a forecast, so there's some that are coming online. So this is what they're projecting, and I have to check with Tyler in terms of how many are expected to be coming online in the next 2 years.
Okay.
Madam Chair. Just a question back on page 15. I know there's a reduction of the $229 million from general fund to that comes from our sales tax, the repeal on the grocery tax. Is there anything in the budget that, because this impacts localities, does it not direct local aid? Is there anything in the budget that would come back and fill the coffers on another side, so to speak?
Madam Chair, we do have a slide a little bit later I can show you, but the governor's proposal to expand with digital downloads for the sales tax does have a forecast to backfill a little, but we have also a slide that shows that there will still be an impact to localities in terms of that gap, because it's not, the digital downloads are not forecasted to be as high as this number.
Thank you.
Okay. As a note, we mentioned to provide an overview of direct aid, the base budget moving from FY25 to FY26 has a reduction in general fund, but there's also an increase in non-general fund. A lot of that is coming from the literary funds that we have. And also there's some movement of funding that is currently in direct aid for early childhood that we're moving over the Department of Ed. And so there's some money moving out of direct aid from there, so that's also part of the reduction. In our supplemental education, we had some other proposals on a smaller scale that are listed here. Increase the community and schools funding, the vision screening grants, some expansion of that. Reach Virginia, the Virginia Holocaust Museum, this is for educational services and was mentioned in the governor's introduced budget. The dual enrollment credentials, these are 2 transfers of programs that are coming from SHEV. The entire program's moved over just to align with some activities that was already taking place at DOE. In the Department of Education, there's a request to have about $40 million for a new state assessment system. This is to replace the current one that's used for the SOL testing. The higher number in the first year is some one-time costs to help with upgrading that. In addition, the Board of Education's passed some changes to that, and it's also part of a work group that had made proposals on how that testing should occur. There's a reduction to the Office of School Quality. This is based on current staffing levels. There's also additional money for the maintenance of the teacher licensure system. And then the large item here, and we do have a slide we'll talk about a little more with the child care subsidy program, is the increased funding for child care that has been mentioned through the governor's briefings as well as some other areas. There's an investment of $7.2 million each year for the student access to mental health services, as well as establishing a chief school mental health officer. And then in non-general fund options, there's some backfilling of the child care subsidy program with some federal COVID relief funds in order to help increase that amount in the first year. And then there's also some alignment of appropriations with the Virtual Virginia program. In terms of some language changes, there's some smaller language changes that the clarifying of some language regarding alternative education. And this is just some specifications for how Department of Ed should calculate it. In this teacher scholarship program, there was some adjustments to that to raise the maximum award and expand the eligibility. And then in early childhood, there's several language adjustments. So once we get into that section of early childhood later in the presentation, I'll explain some of those different language amendments that are occurring across the programs. In the area of the Secretary of Education, there is a request to have the Secretary of Ed look into compensation and to have a work group that provides recommendations on what it means in terms of the competitiveness, and for the work group to make recommendations on the regional, comparative, and differentiated pay analysis and definition of that compensation should vary across the Commonwealth and how that pay impacts student achievement, as well as development of criteria and an implementation plan for that. We know that there's a lot of interest in the teacher pay. This is one thing that the governor had introduced in terms of the study. In the Department of Education, this is carrying forward some legislation or some language that was included in the last biennium regarding flexibility of childcare, and a smaller adjustment for the Virginia Commission for the Arts to carry forward some funding. I mentioned we have a few topics that will provide a little more deeper dive into the numbers that we had here, but again, if there's any questions, I'll stop here to answer them. In terms of rebenchmarking, as we mentioned at the annual meeting, you'll hear the standards of quality, you'll hear about rebenchmarking, and a lot of it comes back to what you'll see here. If the committee is, or if the General Assembly is making decisions in terms of wanting to change a staffing ratio or wanting to make different adjustments to funding, it's running through this funding framework. And what happens is they look at, if you change a staffing ratio, they look to see how many positions are being changed. They look at the enrollment, and then they apply a cost, and that determines a share. And in rebenchmarking, every 2 years, what they do is they kind of reassess all of these costs, and that's what rebenchmarking does. So this framework is used often in the background to run estimates in terms of any decisions that are being made. When we talked about rebenchmarking, I mentioned at the annual meeting we had a higher dollar amount. The final numbers did come in a little lower for rebenchmarking, and you'll see here on these slides, the majority of the costs that drove rebenchmarking were the prevailing costs increasing. This is largely a result of the higher teacher salary increases that were put in place over the last biennium, as well as inflationary costs and increased expenditures in the non-personnel areas. We did see some savings when there was an update to the local composite index, and that came in after we had done the presentation in November. After we moved those one-times, and that one-time investment was during the last biennium, we had a COVID hold harmless because there was not as much data available when the last rebenchmarking occurred, and so there was hold harmless payments. And then if you recall, during the September budget that we passed, we had a large amount of one-time flexible funding of $418 million. So by being able to use those amounts that we had provided in the prior biennium, we were able to then reduce the total rebenchmarking cost to that $204 million that you see here. This is a chart that kind of marks out the different amounts that we just showed you in the table a little more visually. As I mentioned, the prevailing costs and the updates to salaries as well as inflation for non-personnel are really what drove the largest increases in rebenchmarking. But being able to have these one-time costs offset, that was where it provided a bit of a savings. I've mentioned this before. This is just a note here that the major drivers were the different non-personnel. Also, we did see some shifts in the number of students. While we had a lower enrollment, we did see increased numbers in free lunch eligibility students, which is used for numbers for our at-risk program. We saw larger numbers of special education populations, as well as English language learners, and those programs have some additional costs associated with them. So we did see some growth in those program areas. This slide here is a reference regarding salaries. This is a graph that shows all of the salary changes that have occurred. We've had some significant investments over the last 10 years, and in the proposed budget, we have a 1% bonus proposed as well as a 2% salary increase in the second year. This graph provides some changes in terms of what we've seen with the funded instructional position salaries, and just shows you some percent changes that we've seen as a result of the actions that have been taken with the General Assembly in terms of investment in salaries. The average was ranging between 13 and as high as 15% in terms of what those salaries had increased. Lottery revenues, just to note that about 10% of the funding, it's about 9% when we looked at the graph we provided earlier, but the lottery provides funding for direct aid to public education. So if the lottery forecast is going up or down, that impacts resources for K-12. This newest forecast has projected lottery proceeds of about $852.9 million for 2025 and 2026. Sales tax. We had this question regarding how the sales tax is working. As a quick reference, this is a triangle that I have to repeat to myself several times, and I'm happy to try to answer the question as best I can. Once you calculate all of the cost for direct aid, the sales tax is used to offset that. And so this triangle on the top part you'll see is the sales tax offset. And then from there, once you reduce that, you're able to look at the local share for the state and for the localities. We provide that as a reference to talk about if there's changes in sales tax, it has a ripple effect in terms of what's available and how that would be paid. So the question came earlier from Senator Hashmi about the proposed sales tax that's coming in. And on this slide, you'll see that the base expansion that's proposed in the governor's budget to expand the base for digital downloads is expected to bring in $53.6 million and $138.9 million. The basic aid offset, what would come to K-12, would help to reduce that by, is a negative of 29.7 and 77. So the net impact is 23.9 and 61.9 in terms of what we would get for that. The removal of the payment of the in lieu of sales tax, that removal, this is still going to impact what we do, but it is not going to fully offset what we have in terms of the digital downloads. So we still have a total net impact to school divisions when you take into account the expansion of the digital downloads, the removal of the supplemental payments. The impact to divisions is going to be a reduction of 90.7 million and 52.7 million. So those two are not going to cancel each other out based on the current estimates that we have. We mentioned the literary fund. This is another source of revenue sometimes for K-12, or it's dedicated to K-12. It can be used for a variety of reasons. It was used for school construction in the past, and it has been used in some other occasions for teacher retirement, but there has been an effort to focus more on the school construction. The forecast currently, based on what is used and what is proposed in the governor's budget, there is use of the literary fund for teacher retirement of $150 million per year, as well as the one-time teacher retirement deposit of $235 million. Moving over to early childhood care and education. As a quick note, this is something that we've seen from Department of Education in terms of the various programs that are provided to support early childhood. There's the Virginia Preschool Initiative, there's the Mixed Delivery Preschool Grant Program, there's the Early Head Start and the Head Start Program, which is the federal program, and there's the Child Care Subsidy Program. So there's 4 different areas. The state is providing funding in the mixed delivery, the VPI, and the child care areas. This chart shows, this was before the governor's introduced budget, so these were some these were some tables that were handed out with the Early Childhood and Care Commission in terms of the total funding for the Child Care Subsidy Program, Mixed Delivery, and Virginia Preschool Initiative. We had some high dollar investments using COVID relief funds in 2023 and 2024, and the projected was to have a decline of with the newer amounts once those COVID relief funds went away. The numbers here show the number of students that are being, or number of children that are being served in each of these programs. So again, I want to emphasize this is before what the governor's introduced budget has, but in the absence of any investment, this is what these projections would be for 2025 and 2026. What the governor is proposing in the introduced budget with Virginia Preschool Initiative is some reductions to the preschool initiative, and this is through a series of different actions. The first one is to remove the LCI cap. This is for any school divisions that are above the 0.5 amount. So that means school divisions that are at 0.8, and those are the ones that typically they're calculated that they have a higher ability to pay. So it was an incentive to remove that cap so that school divisions that had a higher ability to pay would provide VPI services to students in that area. So the Fairfax area would have that. The removal of that cap would make it so that these school divisions that may have had a 0.8 or a 0.7, they only had to pay the 0.5, now they have to pay that full amount. And that's how that's done with direct aid. So it's an alignment of the way it's done for direct aid, but that cap has been removed. In addition, there's some savings that are being captured from the VPI non-participation rates.
Senator Lucas has a question.
Wendy, does that mean that if you're going to remove the CPS, if you're going to remove it, does that mean that there's going to be a standard somewhere?
To remove the LCI cap?
Yes.
Well, the LCI is already set for all the school divisions, but instead of saying if you would usually pay the 0.7, now if under any circumstances you pay 0.7, but we were always keeping a cap at 0.5, they now have to pay the full amount. And we do have Department of Education coming in, and they're going to give a full presentation and can explain more in terms of how that would work and what that impact would be. And we have those amounts by school division that we'd be happy to provide to you in terms of what that impact is. And this impacts mostly the school divisions that have a higher ability to pay.
Could you speak a little bit to the VPI non-participation rate? Are there localities or entities that do not participate in VPI?
I believe, I'll need to confirm, but I believe most are participating, but sometimes the projected amounts are based on the K-12 enrollments, and they're looking at that, and sometimes you don't get the number of students that are expected. So each year it's looking at an estimate based on kindergarten, I apologize, kindergarten enrollments, and they're looking to see that those students who are in the 4-year-old program, and it can be for 3, so those estimates don't always come in. So sometimes they say, well, we'll hold this many slots and fund for that, and in the hopes that they come in. So it's a way to forecast how that's done. But again, we will have DOE here to explain more of that when they come in. With the VECF, the mixed delivery, this is to maintain the slots that were funded through the federal LEAF dollars, so there's an increase there. With the child care subsidy program, there's an additional funding with the amount that's proposed in the governor's budget, but there is some offsets that are being provided through the ARPA funding.
Pardon me for being slow to pick this up, but I just want to make sure that I understand. So I'm looking at page 36, the mixed delivery. Children served in 23 is 2,000, in 24 is 2,500, and then it drops to about 650. So turning over to page 37, this mixed delivery funding, is that to get us back up to 2,000
Yes.
children who are being served?
And we are trying to get the projected amounts, but that, right, this was a
Okay.
slide we had before, and this was before the governor's proposal. So it's trying, all of these, as far as we've been told, and again, this is where DOE can explain on Thursday, is to maintain those levels and to not have this drop off after the federal funds expire.
Okay, thanks.
The last one is digital wallets, and there's $1 million that's set aside to help with what is being proposed, and I'll talk about that in the language updates in regards to trying to encourage business to pay into and probably provide a way to support that. So there's a digital wallet platform. And again, we'll have more on Thursday when they present, but to discuss about how they can provide funding through an online platform and be able to access that and to be able to pay for the early childhood care. In early childhood, there's a lot of language adjustments, but with mixed delivery, there's an interest to move all, and this is for several programs, any unused funds to go over to the child care program versus those used to come back to the general fund, but to keep those within the early childhood program. There's some changes in terms of the participation. There's the creation of reporting and wait lists, and then one thing that's been added is the alignment of requirements that currently happen with the child care subsidy program to have additional attendance, parental workforce requirements, and co-payments with this program. In addition, they're asking the department to review the program and to provide a report by July 1. With the early childhood BPI program, again, unused funds are being carried over. So essentially trying to keep early childhood care funds within early childhood care, and if any monies are unused, being able to put those back and be able to carry those over each year. In addition, there's some things that we've already mentioned in terms of reporting requirements for other areas and that change in the local composite index. Last, if there's any remaining COVID relief funds in other areas, they're redirecting unused balances to this program by June 30th. In other education, there was no additional funds that are proposed in other education for this budget. There are some adjustments to it, but just to let you know, these are the amounts and base funding amounts for the various museums that we have in Virginia.
There are no new general funds, but on the next slide, there's one non-general fund adjustment that's funded through the National Science Foundation for the Virginia Museum of Natural History.
And with that, that concludes the K-12. We'll talk very briefly about higher education, and I do want to introduce Chev after that and have them speak towards their budget recommendations. Anya, would you be able to switch slides for us? In higher education, I'll talk a little bit before Anya gets started, but in higher education, these areas cover both the institutions that the public institutions that we have, as well as the State Council for Higher Education, our cooperative extensions, well as our higher education centers and some of our affiliate partnerships. That includes EVMS. We also have some funding that's provided to Jefferson Labs and a couple other areas as well. So that's just these items on the right side of your slide here in terms of higher education. I'll quickly go through these in the interest of time. We provided this at the annual meeting in terms of the number of institutions and the breadth of higher education across Virginia. In terms of enrollments, this just gives you a feel for the size and scope of the various institutions that we have in Virginia, both public, private, private nonprofit to say, and then the public two-year, the community college system. Enrollments has been a strong topic of interest. We heard about this at the annual meeting in terms of enrollments. We have seen a little bit of a rebound in enrollments since the pandemic. But again, on this next slide, you'll see that just as in K-12, we are expecting enrollments to decline with K-12, and that could have a ripple effect on higher education for the students who are coming straight from high school. And so this is something we are keeping an eye on moving forward with institutions. We covered this at the annual meeting as well in terms of strengths of the higher education system. We do have a diverse set of institutions, both public and private. We do have very strong outcomes and graduation rates across this. For a statewide average, of course, we do have varying outcomes by institution. And we have been consistently ranked as one of the top 2 states for higher education based on Smart Asset. As I mentioned, we are facing some challenges with the enrollment declines. The continued question is costs are growing to attend of the value of a college degree. And as I mentioned, the variation in outcomes and growth in costs. In terms of funding, when you're working in higher education, you'll hear different terms and terminology. Education and general programs is where the state puts the most of its investments. And this is really for the instruction and support services that are provided to students on campus. There's something called auxiliary services, and this is the dorms, the food, this is the athletics that take place. The state does not provide funding in that area. There's also financial aid, sponsored research, and then there's some different programs under the Chev operating. We have some economic development programs at VCCS, the higher ed centers, and those affiliate partnerships. In terms of recent actions, there's been a lot of investment in higher education operating support as well as financial aid. These items are listed here in terms of what actions that we took last biennium. When we met with institutions, you'll hear something called 6-year plans. We have those they occur every year, but we meet individually, staff of the money committees as well as Secretary of Education and Secretary of Finance meet with institutions, and these are some of the themes that we had seen from their 6-year plans that they were submitted this year. And you may be hearing from institutions about these various topics if you're meeting with them or as we go through this in terms of prioritization. With the governor's introduced budget, there is some money in SB 29 to provide funding for Virginia State University, and this is a match to their federal program for the extension office. There's extension services, and then in the SB 30, which is this upcoming biennium, We have some various spending initiatives. We also have some savings and reductions and some transfers of funding, and I'll quickly show you what those are. In terms of spending, one of the higher dollar amounts is the merger of ODU and EVMS. This was legislation that passed last session, but the proposal is still moving forward with that to move forward with the merger. There's $16.6 million in campus safety and security. There's various funding for the Workforce Credential Grant. This is an industry-based non-credit funding program that's done by Pay for Performance. There's funding for regional career placement centers at VCCS, a mental health statewide contract, and the military survivors and dependents. This is the stipend component of that program. The remaining ones are some various institution-specific initiatives, as well as investments in the Virtual Library of Virginia Consortium. On savings and reductions, there are some programs that are being reduced. The Chev Pell Initiative, there is removal of funding in the second year. In addition, the Online Virginia Network, removal of funding in both years. New College Institute, there's removal of funding in the second year. The College Transfer Grant, this is a reduction to align more with what the current enrollments are. There's removal of the Fund for Excellence Innovation at Chev and the Student Loan Ombudsman Program, as well as an optometry program. We've asterisked some that do have some code authorization that are there as well. I mentioned some transfers. This is the Chev internship program, the innovative internship programs. This was in central accounts. It was at $10 million for FY24. The money moved over and is $20 million, but it's put more on the first year, and then the funds in the second year are designated as one time. These other ones are some smaller transfers of funding that you'll see here. In terms of language amendments, one of the bigger ones is the Maintain Affordable Access. This is funding that was provided in the September budget. It was $75 million. It was recommended to move to the base budget of the institutions. In the proposed budget, it remains in a central account, and then there's some items that are added to that. So it requires the secretary and the Chev to establish performance standards, and it authorizes the secretary in the second year to determine the funding allocations, and that is contingent upon institutions not raising tuition and fees by 2.5% or the lower of inflation, either 2.5 or inflation. There's some language in terms of the campus safety and security funding that's provided, and on capital requirements as well. And last, the tuition assistance grant, there's a proposal to have the online amount increase from 50% to 75%, and for Chev to look into reappropriating $2 million to look at a study to implement an online system for applicants. And then the FAFSA simplification, we'll be talking about that more in future meetings, but this is some alignment because of some federal changes that are occurring. These are some other ones that are specific to institutions. And with that, I will be happy to answer any questions regarding the higher education introduced budget. Yes, and I know they've got a short amount of time, and we've gone a little bit over, but that we've tried to load the first part of the meeting to be able to give you as much of an overview as we can. I do want to introduce a few people from Chev. Many of you had seen Peter Blake, a longtime state employee and had been at Chev for 11 years. He just retired, so we are welcoming Alan Edwards, who is the interim director at Chev. And also, you'll meet with Lee Andes, who is going to be presenting. He is the director of finance policy and innovation. And then with that, I will welcome Tom Allison, who will quickly go over our budget, the budget recommendations for Chev.
Good afternoon, Madam Chair, members of the committee. Again, my name is Tom Allison. I'm the Associate Director for Finance and Innovation at Chev. It's a pleasure to be before you today. As a quick reminder, a piece of background, if you're not familiar with SHEV, we are the coordinating board for higher education in Virginia. We are made up of a 13-member board appointed to 4-year terms, and our mission is to advocate and promote higher education in Virginia. We have a number of specific missions, but one of them is financial analysis and financial recommendations, which is what brings me before you today. So one of our first duties is to set a strategic plan for higher education in Virginia, and we have set a big goal of achieving a 70% post-secondary attainment rate for all working-age Virginians. And so many of our recommendations that our council approved last week have this specific goal in mind. So as I mentioned, every year the council approves budget and policy recommendations, and this year our recommendations fell into 3 primary themes: student success and workforce outcomes, affordability and access, and institutional operations. We also have a theme of performance and accountability, which we'd like to bring before you today, and this touches upon some of the items that Wendy mentioned in her presentation. But regarding performance and accountability, just wanted to highlight one issue of tuition mitigation. Just wanted to point out the governor's introduced budget ties that $75 million in affordable access from Chapter 1 to a maximum of a 2.5% tuition increase for the institutions. So in order for the institutions to receive their share of the $75 million in affordable access, the institutions must maintain that maximum 2.5% tuition increase, as well as achieve some of the performance metrics that are to be determined by SHEV and the Secretary of Education. Similarly, along this vein, the council recommended $18.2 million in new general fund for the first year and $29.5 million in the second year to address unavoidable cost increases. These are essentially inflation's impact on non-personnel services. So we're taking away the policy choice of salaries and those personnel costs. So this is just SHEV's estimation of the cost of inflation's impact on non-personnel services. Next is the Pell Initiative. Wendy mentioned the $37.5 million that goes through SHEV's budget that is aimed at increasing the recruitment and retention of Pell-eligible students. The governor's budget removes that funding in the second year, but also ties that funding to performance metrics. And I think given that this is a relatively new program coming through SHEV, there are some opportunities to more directly tie those funds to the data that SHEV collects on the enrollment and retention of Pell students. The governor's budget, as Wendy mentioned, adds $4 million in the first year and $5 million in the second year to the Workforce Credential Grant. This program that supports non-credit workforce training that's aligned with high-demand fields is 100% performance-based. So the institutions that participate in this program only get reimbursed based on student success if they either complete the program or earn a industry-recognized license or credential. And then lastly, institutional performance standards. This is a relatively small program that the council has recommended additional flexibility and some benchmarks. And the governor's introduced budget also includes language that aligns the timelines of when this data is available with when SHEV does these assessments. So just wanted to hit the high points on some of these pieces on performance and accountability. But at the highest level, the SHEV's council is recommending an additional $37.5 million in new general fund over the biennium. For context, over the previous biennium, there was an additional $1.2 billion in new general fund. So relatively smaller recommendation compared to previous years. And as you can see, broken down, that's 4% over the base in the first year and just about 6% over the base in the second year. As I mentioned, our recommendations fall into 3 themes: improving student success and labor market outcomes. I mentioned the workforce credential grants. As you can see there, it's about $4 million in the in the first year. That's based on popularity of the program. The enrollments continue to increase in that program, and success rates, which the finance payments are based on, those success rates have remained relatively stable. We also have a theme here around mental health. This has been a high priority of students and institutions in Virginia. And we also have a recommendation on graduate financial aid, which aligns with the governor's recommendation to create a research triangle between Virginia Tech, UVA, and VCU. So I think that that particular piece aligns with the governor's introduced budget. Our second theme on affordability and access. Our council has historically been very supportive of affordability, both in terms of keeping tuition down, but also investing in financial aid, need-based financial aid for the students who have the most difficulty affording college. So our council's recommended an additional $34 million in the first year and $40 million in the second year in undergraduate need-based financial aid. This is based partially on the cost projections that the institutions have told us that they plan to charge over the next biennium during the 6-year plan process that Wendy mentioned, but also due to some federal changes. You might have heard about some changes happening to the EFC, the expected family contribution. This is a calculation done at the federal level that calculates students' ability to pay. There's a number of things that are happening with that calculation that we think is going to increase the unmet need of our students, thus justifying an increase in our undergraduate need-based financial aid to meet that increase in unmet need. And once again, generally we see a connection between unmet need and student success, so we want to keep those graduation rates up. Another large piece is the Virginia Military Survivors and Dependents Education Program. There's two components to this, both the stipend, which was included in the governor's budget, but then also the waiver, which is a much larger chunk of this program. This is essentially deferred tuition revenue from our institutions. There is a piece of legislation that is a governor's bill that would reduce the price of this program, and one that also aligns with the council's recommendations. Council recommends some policy changes that can reduce the cost to the Commonwealth of this program while still maintaining the benefits for these eligible students. And just very briefly, there's some things we can do around requiring applications at the federal level for federal financial aid, using those funds first, and restricting the eligibility to just undergraduate programs instead of graduates, which are included right now. So this is definitely a program you'll continue to hear about, but one that our council looked at closely and is also a focus of the governor's office.
How does the waiver differ from the stipend?
Yes, Madam Chair. So there are two primary pieces. So the waiver waives the need for the eligible student to pay tuition and fees. So there's no dollars exchanged, but it is essentially deferred revenue from the institution. The stipend is essentially for living expenses, so those indirect costs, whether it's childcare, room and board, et cetera, and that runs through Chev's budget, and there is a current line item in the budget for that, whereas there is not one currently for the waiver. Lastly, the last theme is institutional operations. I mentioned that the council's often focused on keeping tuition down while at the same time addressing the unmet need of particularly of low-income students or early disadvantaged students. So we've got that recommendation there that I already mentioned on inflation's impact on non-personnel services. We also have a line item here on addressing funding disparities. This came out of the Chev Cost and Funding Needs Study that concluded in July, and in many ways we see as teeing up the sort of next round of this work that is set to happen in December for the Joint Subcommittee on Higher Education Funding when they will meet. So I know we're short on time, so that concluded the budget recommendations. I did want to highlight a few policy considerations as well that the council recently approved. I mentioned VMSDEP about finding ways to require the FAFSA completion and making that program last dollar, so applying some of the federal aid that's already out there, and then having the remainder be waived by the institutions. And we also have a piece on campus security. This has been a highlight of our council and is also included in the governor's budget. But there's a number of other pieces that I could go on, but I believe we are just about at time. So with that, just wanted to share our contact information here. We have a number of other slides in the appendix for your reference. But with that, Madam Chair, I'm happy to pause my presentation and see if you have any questions.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Senator Lucas, anything?
No.
Thank you very much. We appreciate you being here this afternoon, and we appreciate that. And I know we'll be working with you throughout the session.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
Wendy, anything else for this afternoon? Okay. Thank you all very much for coming this afternoon. We will see you on Thursday at 3 o'clock. Not 3:30, 3 o'clock.